if we knew what we had perhaps seen more than our eyes would have seen. If we had seen what actually was before us, we would, as Cardinal Arinze said, crawl to the altar. Our eyes are closed to the whole invisible world that we have, and therefore things which we see take precedence. The excuses that we make, the important things that we have to do. I happened to read this week the account of what happened at La Salette in 1846. Do you know that heaven was weeping on this very issue? Mélanie and Maximin, unlikely candidates for an apparition, were dumbfounded when they saw this lady dressed as a peasant with her head in her hands. They were also surprised to see her carrying a chain around her neck with the cross and pincers and a hammer. They understood later on what was going on, but not immediately. Why was this lady crying? She had a message for humanity. The tears that she had in her eyes were those of her son, who was weeping specifically because he had given to mankind 6 days, but had kept the 7th to himself. She was a loving mother, tender and close to her children. Notice the way she appeared, in the local garb, and speaking initially French until they started not to understand. And she went, yes, into their local dialect. "Come near, my children. Do not be afraid. I am here to tell you great news." They approached the lady. They stared at her. She was still crying. She seemed like a woman, they say, whose children had beaten her and who had run away into the mountains to cry, this lady had. The beautiful lady was tall. She was all light. She was dressed like the woman of the region, a long dress, a long apron tied at the waist, a shawl crossed and knotted in the back. On her head she wore a peasant bonnet. Roses formed a crown around her head and outlined the fringes of her shawl and shoes. Light shimmered like a fiery diadem on her forehead. A chain seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. A finer chain held a brilliant crucifix on her breast, with a hammer on one side and pincers on the other. And so she starts to speak. But they say she wept all the while she spoke to us. "If my people do not obey, I shall be compelled to loose my son's arm. It is so heavy that I can no longer hold it." Now, we forget that this was actually going to be the beginning of a period of great violence in France. "How long have I suffered for you?" she goes on. "If my son is not to abandon you, I am obliged to entreat him without ceasing. But you take no heed of that." no matter how well you pray in the future, no matter how well you act, you will never be able to make up to me what I have endured on your behalf. That comes through in apparitions of Our Blessed Lady, the Mother of God holding up the arm of her Son lest it strike. Now here, Mother and Son identify themselves in these words. I have given you 6 days to work. The 7th I have reserved for myself, yet no one will give it to me. This is what causes the weight of my Son's arm to be so heavy. And then this one. The cart drivers cannot swear without bringing in my Son's name. These are the 2 things that make my Son's arm so heavy. So let's look at this. We are taught in our faith that the strict obligation that we have is satisfied by assistance at Holy Mass and abstention from unnecessary servile work. Now, this question of servitude is actually ultra-modern. Initially, it came in after the Constantinian peace, when slaves, hence servi, servile, were no longer to be obliged to do servile work, the work which was theirs on an ordinary working day. It was the beginning of faith impacting on culture in the Christian world. But this one I want to zoom into. When is the obligation satisfied with regard to assistance at Mass? It is not satisfied by the assistance at a non-Catholic celebration which does not have the Holy Sacrifice. Therefore, an Anglican celebration does not cover it. However, an Eastern Orthodox one would, as would one in the Society of St. Pius X. Why? Because it is the same Holy Sacrifice. It is not satisfied by the assistance at a celebration of the Word with Holy Communion when one can easily get to the fullness of the Mass. It would be if that were not the case, e.g. in Africa. Why does the Church ask for this specific element? It's because our worship is Eucharistic, and it's not full if the Eucharist is not celebrated. God will judge our separated brethren according to what they have. They will observe it in their own way, and they will be faithful to it. It's not our business to judge, but we have it and must be present at it. And that must have priority over other things which, in a sense, the Gospel talks about. Excuses. Illness, excuses. A mother who's just had a child and so on, that would excuse. There are reasons which are obvious, but others are not so obvious, and we need to be careful about elasticity. If we have awareness of what we have at our altars, then we would do anything within our power to get there. How can it be otherwise? It's the rendezvous of love. We would run towards our Lord as lovers do towards the arms of their spouse and girlfriend and boyfriend. It's the meeting of love. We want to be there. Our heart beats. And so in that context, it's not just obligation, it's a test. Do we love Jesus? And from there will follow also the other bit. It's not enough just to be there. The Sunday was meant for our healing and also for our intimacy with Him. Our healthy recreation, what we would call let up, lest we be always in a hurry through life. It's the rhythm that God put in the universe. We inherited that from the Hebrews, And of course it became the first day, the 8th day, the day of eternity, the resurrection. But the instinct follows to leave aside what can wait for the other working days. There are areas of hesitation. A student, should he study? Well, in the monastery we had to study theology and even philosophy and scripture for a certain amount of time on a Sunday. It was part of the timetable, but that was sacred science and it didn't distract. If, however, one's study, one's academic discipline is something which does not nourish the soul, but is actually quite draining, there would be no moral sin in doing a certain amount of mental work because it's not servile, but the question of proportion enters into it. If one spends the same amount of time, e.g. 8 hours, doing applied mathematics, it's not really entering into the mode of the Sabbath rest, as the Lord meant it for his creatures and for our healing. So it's a question of proportion. Often in this question it's not either or, but an intelligent both and. Sport. This is a delicate one. Now, I'll make a little parenthesis here. I'm from Wales, and when I was growing up, there was still in the air a certain frowning on certain things. My brother, who was 5.5 years older than I was, when he was small, was given to understand from the beginning that even the playing of football out there on a Sunday, personally kicking the ball around, was not to be done on the Sunday in Wales. That was the way he grew up, and then he told me how, as he was growing up, that sort of became a little bit okay. But what was always not allowed for us was anything with regard to going to an organized match. And we were horrified looking at Catholic countries where that kind of thing would go on. Look at Spain with bullfights. Now there's a difference. I'm not saying that the nonconformist Welsh thing was the correct way, but what I am saying was hugely healing. There was not a noise on a Sunday, and we knew that it was different. It was the Lord's day. Now, with regard to this other thing, healthy recreation is okay. But be careful if that actually goes into the realm of spending a huge chunk of the Lord's day going to something which actually is in a very, very different atmosphere, where usually swearing, drinking and all the rest of it will be part and parcel of the event. I think you know what I mean. They're not quite the same. And it's only a Christian of deep interiority who will perceive the difference. So here we're on a different level, if you like. What does the Lord want of me? He might be asking more of me because he has more to give me on his day. It's the inbuilt retreat of the week. He has graces for me. I remember at university, it was actually a great joy when the day of the Lord came in Wales. We're going out to the mid-70s, early 70s, and it was different. It was a strange kettle of fish because they might come, some of them, back from the pub on a Saturday or Sunday evening, but they'd be singing hymns, drunk hymns. But it was there. And also, this question, you could see straight away who was a Christian or not. They'd all have a tie or a dress. And it was a bit different because things were calmer in those days, and Sunday was Sunday. And we had time for each other, which, by the way, matters. Fellowship. We need time to rest and be with each other. Quality time, friendship, not watching a screen, but engaging with each other. It's healthy détente. That's why, in a wider context, I would say be careful about doing the same thing, students, as you would every other day on a Sunday. The other thing I want to go into is the question of language. The Lord, in the Sermon on the Mount, was very clear on this. Let your yes be yes, your no, no. And he added, anything more than this comes from the evil one. So, if we bring in God to underline a point, we're sinning. Let's get this straight, it had to be confessed. And anything which is bringing God into the equation as a punctuation mark is not right. And we can't, if we're engaging with God in contemplative mode, in mode of love, how can we bring him into the question when it means just underlining a point with his name? And it becomes even worse if we bring in the holy name itself. But also, why use vulgar language? It's not the same sin, but it's linked. Vulgarity should be excluded from our vocab. I remember the English teacher, who was also the religious teacher in school, we used to call him Copperbonds because he had red hair and he spoke Welsh, and he said, "It's a lazy use of language." And he was encouraging us to get a rich vocabulary. It's far better, even humanly, to have ways and means of making a point without going into bad language. It's just peer pressure to be virile like the others. I conclude with a story for the little people. It's what happened in 1280. And as I saw this, I was reminded of the burning bush, which brings me back to where I started. We have here more than what Moses had when he was told to take off his shoes. It happened in Czechoslovakia, in Slavonice. A herdsman, tending his flocks in the fields outside the city, was surprised to see a mysterious fire burning atop bushes that had grown over a heap of stones. On approaching the spectacle, he saw within the blaze a host that remained unaffected by the flames and heat. The priest who was called to the scene identified the host as being the one in a precious vessel that had been stolen in the dead of night, the year before. The culprit was never identified, but it was apparent that he had discarded the host where it had just revealed itself. Notice this bit. The priest deposited the host in a vessel he had brought with him, and together with several parishioners who had hurried to see the miraculous fire, proceeded toward the city, only a short distance away. On approaching the city gates, it was noticed that the host had disappeared from the vessel. It was again found in the flames atop the heap of stones. After retrieving it again, the priest and people once more made for the city. But the host disappeared yet another time. Only after the priest and the people promised to establish a sanctuary on the place of the discovery did the host remain in the vessel for its return to the parish church. The promise was honoured, and there arose above the stone heap a chapel that soon proved to be too small for the crowds that travelled great distances to adore the miraculous host. So the host is still there in the initial stages. Rather like the one in Venezuela, it's still there. The bleeding host that was caught burning, and it can be seen burning on video. Just like the Sacred Heart that we're feasting, by the way, Friday at 11 o'clock here with Mass and Benediction. For these pilgrims, several indulgences were granted by the bishop and afterwards by Gregory, Bishop of Prague. The chapel continued to be a great attraction until, now what happened? The Hussites. They're the beginnings of the rebellion, a sort of anticipation of Protestantism. In the hands of these Hussites, destruction and also heresy followed. So the chapel was razed to the ground, although the little heap of stones remained undisturbed. Following the retreat of the Hussites, another chapel was built in 1476. So the Pope granted plenary indulgence to all who would devoutly visit this church and with true penitence receive the Holy Eucharist. So it became a great centre of devout reception of Holy Communion. That meant in those days, as it still means actually in the East, going to confession and being prepared. It's not enough just to go to Holy Communion. Why am I saying this? It is a reminder. The Lord occasionally, and this book is just one book full of miracles, occasionally lifts the veil. He was asked one time why he did this, and he was told, the person who asked it was given this message, that he would prefer not to have to do it, but he does it because of our hardness of heart.